Henrik woke up to find his dead grandfather standing over him like a shadow in the whirling, powdery snow. Olgot leaned forward and raised his boot-clad foot. "Get up!" Henrik slowly lifted his head. He thought he could see light. Henrik had struggled along in a daze, yard by yard through the snow, but in the end he had made it. He could just glimpse the veranda of the main house through the curtains of snow, and he ploughed over to it. The door had been broken open. The Sørelius brothers had been here. Henrik pulled open the veranda door and fell headlong over the threshold. He staggered through the next doorway. He found himself in the big kitchen. On the worktop stood a block containing kitchen knives. Henrik grabbed the handle of the biggest one and pulled it out. He went back into the main house. He was standing in a long corridor in the doorway of a small room. A little girl of about 5 or 6 with blonde hair was sitting up in bed. "Hello," was all he said. The girl looked at him. "Have you seen anyone else here?" he asked. "Any other men?" The girl shook her head. "I just heard them," she said. "They were clomping around and they woke me up. I was scared to go out." "You need to stay in here. Where are your mum and dad?" "Daddy went out to Mummy." "And where's your mummy?" "In the barn. Can I go into Gabriel's room?" "Who's Gabriel?" "My little brother." Henrik nodded with some effort. "Course." The girl quickly jumped out of bed and scampered past him. Henrik went back out to the veranda. 2 shadows were moving out there. They slowly came closer through the snow. He wasn't sure if it was the brothers, but raised the axe anyway. By the time the outer door was opened, he had already swung it. Tilda staggered forwards in the swirling snow, Martin by her side. They had almost reached Eel Point now. Tilda could see the main house with faint lights shimmering in the windows. She started moving again into the inner courtyard, which was completely covered in snow. It came up to her waist in some places, and she had to force her way through the drifts. She carried on towards the house, her gun at the ready. When Tilda reached the veranda, she looked at the door. The lock had been broken. She grabbed hold of the handle and opened the door. Then something slender and metallic grey came whirling through the opening. Axe was all she was able to think before it hit her in the face. She could hear Martin shouting in the distance. But by then she had already begun to fall backwards, down the steps and back out into the snow. The murderer had stepped out of the shadows among the trees, walked over to Ethel and whispered, "Come down to the water with me and you can have a fix of heroin from me, completely free." Ethel had nodded. Joachim shivered and pushed the dream pictures out of his head. A rumble like thunder shook him. He woke up properly and looked around him. He was sitting on the front row in the hidden prayer room. The torch had gone out and the only light came from the single bulb in the loft, seeping in through the narrow gaps in the wall. And the rumbling noise? It was the storm, roaring its way in over the coast. The blizzard had reached its peak. But Joachim thought he could hear other sounds too. Someone was walking slowly along the aisle beside him. He heard the scraping sound of footsteps from a figure passing all the benches behind him. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw that a shadow with a pale face had stopped beside his bench and was standing there, motionless. "Katrine," whispered Joachim, without daring to turn his head. "Katrine," he whispered again. "I found Ethel's jacket and the note from the neighbours. Katrine, I think you knew who killed my sister." There was no reply. "Hello?" Henrik shouted to the figure in the snow. "Are you okay?" It was a stupid question because the body below him was lying motionless with a bloody face. A few yards behind her stood a man, as if he were frozen solid in the whirling snow. Then he strode forward and knelt down. "Tilda!" he shouted. "Tilda!" She moved her arms feebly and tried to raise her head. suddenly coughed and started vomiting violently in the snow. "Drop it now!" The man was talking about the kitchen knife, Henrik realized. He was still clutching it in his hand. He didn't want to drop it. The Sorelius brothers were around somewhere. The woman had stopped vomiting. She raised her head and shouted to Henrik through the howling wind, "Henrik Jansson! You're under arrest for robbery with violence!" There was a sudden tinkling noise, just a couple of inches from his right ear. Henrik turned his head and saw that a black, uneven hole had appeared in one of the small panes of glass in the veranda windows. A figure had stepped out of the half-open door of the barn and was standing there in the snow. In the glow from the outside light, Henrik could see that the figure was holding a slender stick in its hands. No, not a stick, it was a gun, of course. A man in a black hood, Tommy. The gun in his hands jerked, once, twice. The face of the man in front of Henrik contorted suddenly, and he went down. Tilda saw Martin jerk on the steps. He collapsed and landed heavily in the snow just a few yards from her. She heard 2 more bangs from the direction of the barn. Tilda kept her head down. Her pistol. She had dropped it when she fell in the snow. She began to feel around with her hands. A figure was moving through the snow. He had a black hood over his head and a gun in his hands. When he realized that Tilda had seen him, he shouted something into the wind. She didn't answer. Her hand was still burrowing in the snow, and suddenly it felt something hard and heavy down there. At first the object just slid away, but then she managed to get hold of it. She pulled the gun out of the snow and aimed in the direction of the barn. "Police!" she yelled. The masked man said something in reply, but the wind ripped his words to shreds. "Abba, Baba," it sounded like. "Stand still and drop the gun!" The man stopped, but didn't drop his gun. He dropped to his knees between 2 snowdrifts, less than 10 yards away. He raised the gun and aimed it at her again, and Tilda fired 2 shots at him in rapid succession. Then she ducked back behind the drifts, and at almost the same moment the light went out. Everything went black. The blizzard had caused a power cut at Eel Point. So Ethel went down the dark paths, down to the water. There she sat down obediently and got her reward. Peace. The murderer waited patiently until Ethel's head was drooping, then went over and gave the unresisting body a hard shove, straight down into the winter water. Joachim was still sitting slumped on the bench, motionless. The storm continued to howl over the roof. "Katrine," he whispered. But she was no longer with him. "Katrine." She was gone. Then suddenly he heard something more than the wind through the cracks in the barn, someone shouting, a volley of shots somewhere down below the hayloft. The pale light that had been seeping through the wall from the bulb in the loft suddenly went out. The electricity had gone, Joachim realized. After several minutes, a flickering light began to glow somewhere in the barn, a pale yellow glow that rapidly increased in strength. Tilda got up slowly on unsteady legs. Martin was lying motionless a couple of yards away. His lifeless body was already well on the way to being covered with snow. She couldn't see the man who had shot at her. She moved quickly up the steps to the house. Inside the veranda was a dark figure, half lying on the rag rug just inside the door. "Are you hurt, Henrik?" she asked. "I've been stabbed." "Henrik? Who shot Martin?" "There are 2 of them," he said. "Tommy and Freddie. They've got a hunting rifle, an old Mauser." Tilda turned and jumped down from the steps, crouching between the drifts. She began to move through the snow over towards the barn. The broad doorway gaped like the opening of a cave. She peered inside, pitch black. The electricity was still off. With her pistol at the ready, she moved inside onto the earth floor. Suddenly she heard a faint tinkling sound. A second or so later it grew a little lighter around her, a flickering, dancing glow. A fire was burning next to the steep wooden staircase a few yards away, leading up to the hayloft. A man was standing on the far side of the fire. The man's gaze was fixed on the growing flames and his face was shiny. He looked excited. "Police!" she shouted. "Get down on the floor!" The man remained standing, his mouth open. "My brother's looking for a way out," he said. "Round the back." "Lie down." "Okay, okay." The man nodded and got down on his stomach with some effort. She quickly grabbed his wrists, pulled them back and slipped on the cuffs. She saw a shadow approaching out of the corner of her eye. She spun around. It was Joachim Westin. "Snow," he said. "We have to smother the fire." "Can you manage without me?" asked Tilda. Joachim nodded. Tilda left the burning staircase. She had to go back into the darkness. She kept close to the northern wall. Then a door appeared, and Tilda went through it. The room on the other side was large and even colder. Tilda stopped with the feeling that she wasn't alone in the darkness. She lowered her pistol, listened, and took a step forward. A shot rang out. She ducked, without knowing if she'd been hit or not. Her ears were ringing. She waited. Nothing else happened. When Tilda finally looked up into the darkness, she saw another closed door, 4 or 5 yards away. It was a way out, but there was someone standing in front of it, a man. He had rolled the balaclava up to his forehead, and his pale face bore a resemblance to Freddy's. He had an old rifle over his shoulder. Tilda steadied the hand holding the pistol, aiming at Tommy. "Drop the gun!" But Tommy just stood there like a sleepwalker, almost as if someone were holding on to him. His eyes were lowered and his right hand was resting on the door handle, as if he were on his way out. But his legs seemed to be incapable of movement. "Tommy?" He didn't reply. A narcotic-induced psychosis? She walked slowly over to Martin's murderer, silently reached out to his shoulder and carefully unhooked the rifle. When she nudged his arm, he suddenly gave a start and came to life. He fell backwards. The iron handle was pushed down and the door opened. It flew open, torn back by the storm. He tumbled out into a snowdrift, got up and staggered away. Tilda raced after him, out into the gale. "Tommy!" she shouted. "Stop!" Tommy had reached the low-growing trees on the edge of the forest. After 15 or 20 steps, he was a grey shadow. Then he was gone. By the time Joachim finally managed to put the flames out, almost the entire staircase up to the loft was charred, and thick curtains of smoke hung from the roof beams. There was a sudden scraping noise over by the barn door, and he saw Tilda come stumbling in from the storm. She had her pistol in one hand and an old hunting rifle in the other. She sank down over by the wooden wall and breathed out. "He's gone," she said. Joachim got up. "I have to see my children," he said, walking towards the door. "Will you be okay?" Tilda nodded. Joachim went inside the veranda and closed the door. A man was lying stretched out on the rug. Dead? No. He was just deeply asleep. Joachim walked into the house, but stopped in the hallway. Ethel was there. She was standing in front of the doors to the children's rooms. She had come to collect her daughter. Ethel was going to take Livia away with her. Joachim didn't dare go up to her. He simply bent his head and closed his eyes. "Trust me," he thought. He opened his eyes and went on into the house. The corridor by the bedrooms was empty. Tilda had vague memories of being helped up the steps to the veranda late that night. Joachim Westin was walking beside her. He led her to a big room where a mattress made up into a bed lay on the floor. There was a tiled stove nearby. It was warm, and she lay down. An indefinable amount of time later, she was woken by a droning noise and quiet voices, but she hadn't the strength to wonder what was going on. Then she heard Joachim's voice. "The cars can't get through, Tilda. They've borrowed an all-terrain carrier from the army." Soon after, the room was filled with voices and movement, and she was helped out of bed. She was lying in an army carrier. Someone beside her coughed. She recognized his clothes. "Henrik," she said. "What?" asked the man, turning his head towards her. "Henrik, have you done anything else I should know about? There was a death here on the point in the autumn," she went on. "A woman drowned. Some people heard a boat down by the point on the day she died. Was it your boat?" "Not mine," he said quietly. "But I did see it. I was standing by the landing stage the day she died. She had a visitor in a big white boat. It moored by the lighthouses, and someone was standing there. I think it was her." "We can talk about it later," she said. "I'm sure you'll be having plenty of interviews." Joachim lit fires in the tiled stoves at around 9, driving the cold out of the house. Then he woke the children. "Happy Christmas," he said. They'd fallen asleep with their clothes on in Gabriel's bed. That was how he had found them when he came in from the barn the previous night. Livia stretched. "Did you sleep well?" She nodded. "Mummy was here." "Here?" "She came in to see us while you were gone." Joachim looked at his daughter, then at his son. Gabriel nodded slowly. "What did Mummy say?" "She said you'd come soon," said Livia, looking at him. "But you didn't." Joachim woke Freddie, who was a quiet, calm young man without his brother. There hadn't been room for him in the carrier, so Freddie had stayed behind, handcuffed to one of the radiators in the hallway. "Still no sign of your brother," said Joachim. Freddie nodded wearily. Tilda had given Joachim the keys to the handcuffs, and he decided to show a little good faith and trust this Christmas. He released Freddie from the radiator. When the power came back at about 11, Freddie settled down in front of the television to watch Christmas programs. Livia and Gabriel sat down beside him. The telephone was working, and the first call came after lunch. Joachim answered and heard Gerlof Davidson's quiet voice. "So, now you know what a real blizzard is like." "Yes," said Joachim, "we certainly do." "Are you and the children alone now?" "No, we still have one guest here. We did have several visitors, but they're all gone. It's been quite a difficult Christmas." "I know," said Gerlof. "Tilda called me this morning from the hospital. There was something else before I forget. I've recorded something for you." "Recorded?" "It's a few ideas about what happened at Eel Point. You'll get it when they start delivering the post again." The police called to say they would be coming to collect the suspect from Eel Point if Joachim could just find them a piece of flat, open ground where a helicopter could land. He went out and cleared a square in the field behind the house. The helicopter swept in. 2 police officers climbed out. Freddie went along without making any kind of protest. "Are you all okay here now?" shouted one of the police officers. Joachim simply nodded. When the helicopter had vanished in the direction of the mainland, Joachim ploughed back through the snow over towards the road and the 2 snow-covered vehicles. He brushed away the snow from the sides of the larger of them, a van. Then he peered inside. Someone was sitting in there, motionless. It was a man, curled up as if he had desperately tried to preserve his warmth in the driver's seat. The key was in the ignition. The engine must have stopped sometime during the night, and the cold began to creep in. Joachim went back to the house to call the police and tell them the last burglar had been found. The wind stayed away and the sun carried on shining over Eel Point for the next few days. Pale sunlight filtered in through the cracks in the wall as Joachim pulled himself up into the prayer room. Everything was quiet. The letters and mementos still lay on the wooden benches, but no one was sitting there. He picked up Ethel's denim jacket, and suddenly his fingers felt a small, flat object sliding around inside the fabric. Joachim had placed the denim jacket in a plastic bag when Inspector Holmblad arrived 2 days after Christmas. "I've got a few things I'd really like to show you. Would you like to come in for a while?" Joachim led the inspector into the kitchen, where he had cleared the kitchen table. "There," he said. On the table lay the bag containing Ethel's denim jacket and the items he had found in the jacket. There was the hand-written note, and a small gold case that had been tucked inside the lining of the jacket. "What's this?" said Holmblad. "I'm not sure," said Joachim, "but I hope it's evidence." "Where are we going?" asked Livia as they drove away from Eel Point the day before New Year's Eve. "We're going to visit Mummy." 15 minutes later they pulled up at Marnus Church. At last they were standing in a row in front of Katrine's grave. The gravestone was covered in snow until Joachim bent down and quickly swept it clean so that the inscription could be seen. Joachim took a step backwards and stood between Livia and Gabriel. "This is where Mummy is," he said. The children stood motionless beside him. "Do you think it looks nice?" asked Joachim in the silence. It was Gabriel who reacted first. "I think Mummy will be cold," he said. Then he walked cautiously up to the grave in his father's footsteps and silently began to brush away all the snow. Gabriel seemed happy with the result. He rubbed his nose with his gloved hand and looked at his father. "Well done," said Joachim. "Shall we go back to the car?" Gabriel nodded. "I want to stay for a little while," said Livia, her gaze fixed on the headstone. Joachim took Gabriel by the hand and walked back to the main path. They waited there for Livia. After a few minutes, she joined them and the family walked back to the car in silence. At about 3 o'clock on New Year's Eve, Joachim took the underground to Broma to wish his dead sister a happy new year and to try to talk to her murderer. He reached the street where the apple house lay and went up to the closed gate. He gazed at his former home. The neighbouring house was the Heslins. He rang the doorbell. Lisa Heslin opened the door. "Come in, Joachim," she said, "and Happy New Year." "The same to you. Is Michael home?" "He's only gone with the boys to buy some fireworks." Joachim moved into the main room, which had a view of the bare trees and the ice on the bay down below the house. "Can I put your stereo on?" he said. "I've got something I'd like you to listen to." "Of course. Is it music?" Joachim went over and inserted the cassette. "No," he said. "It's just talking." When the cassette started, Gerlof Davidson's slightly grumpy voice came through. "Right, let's see. I've been thinking a great deal about the death of your wife, Joachim. I think someone killed Katrine. A person who left no traces of themselves on the sandy shore and therefore must have come from the sea. I believe he's a powerfully built man, middle-aged. He lives or has a house in southern Gotland, and there he keeps a big boat with an inboard motor. The boat must have been big and fast to be able to cover a day trip between the islands, but at the same time light enough to be able to come into the jetty at Eel Point. But how did the murderer know your wife was going to be home alone that day? I think Katrine knew him. When she heard the sound of the engine approaching across the water, she went down to the shore. The murderer was standing in the prow, holding the murder weapon in his hand when she came out onto the jetty. But your wife wasn't suspicious because he was holding something almost everyone uses when they moor a boat. A wooden boat hook. It's easy to grab the opponent's clothing with the hook. Then you pull, and the victim loses balance and falls into the water. If you want to drown someone, then of course all you have to do is hold the hook beneath the surface of the water. All that is visible afterwards is the odd small tear in the clothing. There are holes like that in your wife's clothes." The crackling voice on the tape fell silent. Lisa had got to her feet. "Who was talking?" "A friend. An old man," said Joachim. "Was Michael at your cottage on Gotland when Katrine died?" "I don't remember." "He must have gone down there sometime to take the boat out of the water, mustn't he?" Lisa looked at him without replying. "I was here in Stockholm the evening Katrine drowned," said Joachim, "and I remember noticing there were no cars in your driveway. Nobody was home." Lisa turned her back on him. "That's enough now, Joachim. I need to make a start." She went over to the front door, opened it, and looked at him. He left, and she quickly closed the door behind him. Joachim heard the lock click into place. He sighed and went out into the street, but stopped when he heard a faint noise carried on the air. It was the hum of a car engine. When it turned into the street, Joachim saw that it was Michael's car. Michael drove up to the garage. His two boys jumped out of the back seat and ran off towards the house, each clutching their own bag of firecrackers. "Joachim, you're back," said Michael, coming out into the street. "What did you dream about that night at Eel Point, Michael? You woke up screaming. Did you see ghosts?" "Sorry?" "You killed my wife," said Joachim. Michael was still smiling, as if he hadn't heard properly. "And the previous year you lured Ethel down to the water," Joachim went on. "You gave her a fix of heroin, then you pushed her into the water." Michael stopped smiling. "She was spoiling the idyll," said Joachim. "And perhaps junkies might give the neighbourhood a bad name, but I'm sure murder suspects are even worse. I think Katrine suspected something. She wanted answers. And you said you'd come over to the island to explain. You came over in your boat and met her down by the lighthouse with a boat hook." Michael walked straight past Joachim, as if he didn't exist. "There's proof," said Joachim. Michael kept on walking towards the gate. "Your business cards. Where did you keep them?" Michael stopped. Joachim moved closer and raised his voice. "Thieving is always a problem with users. They're always looking for something they can pick up. So when my sister went down to the water with you, she took the opportunity to steal something from you. Something valuable out of your jacket pocket." Joachim took a Polaroid photograph out of his pocket. It was a picture of a small object inside a clear plastic bag. A flat case, gold-coloured, with the words Heslin Financial Services engraved on the front. "Your case was hidden inside Ethel's jacket," he went on. "Is it made of gold? I'm sure my sister thought it was." Michael didn't reply. "I've already given this to the police, Michael. I'm sure they'll be in touch." He stood there and watched Michael disappear up the path. His rapid footsteps gave him away. Joachim could imagine what the new year would be like for Michael, waiting for the police car to pull up. "Happy New Year, Michael!" Joachim shouted as Michael opened the front door and went inside. The door slammed shut. He was alone on the street again. He breathed out and lowered his eyes. He waited for a few seconds, then set off again, back to his little family, to celebrate New Year. Far away in the east, the first fireworks could be seen over Stockholm. The rockets drew narrow white lines against the night sky before they burst into a shower of light, then went out, like ghostly lighthouses.